I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 1110 from The Russian Cosmists, The Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We're picking up in Chapter 10, Promethean Theurgy. Russian Cosmism contributed to and benefited from a general ethos prevalent in the first decades of the 20th century, which George L. Klein has termed Promethean Theurgy. The idea is that philosophy should be a form of action, not simply of reflection. From Marx, from Nietzsche, that with the death of God, humanity must create its own destiny, lent philosophical underpinnings to wave after wave of fresh creative energy in all the Russian arts, sciences, and social and political culture. Since leading intellectual historians and others have explored this topic in considerable depth and detail, the purpose of this chapter will be merely to sketch in review some of the major themes, each interwoven with all the others, that characterize both the general Promethean theological ethos and the cosmist tendency in Russian thought. Life creation. As Ezra Pound famously observed, artists are the antennae of the race. In Russia, the symbolist poets and artists were among the first to record the shift in attitude toward nature and life from one of observation, interpretation, and depiction to one of active Promethean creation. The poet Vyacheslav Ivanov, 1866 to 1949, a leading theorist of the movement, stated, "Symbolism never was and never wanted to be merely art. Art is not the creation of images or icons, but the creation of life. Art must go beyond its traditional task of representation and must discover and even create new lives and new realities." The émigré poet Vladislav Kodasevich further noted, "Symbolism did not want to be merely an artistic school, a literary movement. It continually strove to become a life-creating method, and in this was its most profound, perhaps unembodied truth. Its entire history was in essence spent in yearning after that truth. It was a series of attempts, at times truly heroic, to find a fusion of life and art, as it were the philosopher's stone of art." Tvorchestvo, the Russian term for life creation, attempted a new answer to the eternal Russian accursed question of the relationship between art and life, framed earlier in the radical 1860s as a matter of which was more important, Shakespeare or Boots. To the earlier generation of radicals, the correct answer was clearly Boots, but through Tvorchestvo, the symbolists hoped to establish that art and life were not opposed, but when properly understood became one. But what did the symbolists actually understand by creating life? As rhetoric, it sounded grand, ambitious, elevating the artistic process to a godlike act. But in practice, Tvorchestvo sometimes meant little more than projecting an aesthetic, or in some instances simply arty, persona, and trying to live up to the role. For the enthusiastic young symbolists of the early years of the century, the perfect example of Tvorchestvo was the symbolically ideal but in daily life unhappy marriage of Alexander Blok and Lyubov Mendeleeva. Blok not only was considered Russia's greatest poet since Pushkin, but also looked like a divine Russian Apollo who spoke and recited in profound oracular tones. Mendeleeva, whose first name meant love, was not only the daughter of the best-known Russian scientist of the early century, but was also pretty enough to pass for a living embodiment of Preskrasnaya Dama, the beautiful lady of Blok's then best-known cycle of poems. Their marriage was not simply to be a joining of two attractive young mortals, but a union of art and science, poetry and love, the dark, handsome knight and the beautiful lady, the divine male Apollonian spirit, and the eternal feminine Russian Sophia, the creation of a magnificent whole new life beyond the quotidian tedium, embodied in the Russian word byut, humdrum daily existence. A complicated factor was that Bloch's close friend and fellow poet Andrei Bielik, no doubt altruistically attempting to lend triangular stability to the marriage, inserted himself into the relationship, severely testing Oscar Wilde's dictum that in marriage 3 is company and 2 is none. Unfortunately, the ideal couple turned trio proved to be human all too human, and as a consequence, too soon split. As Irina Paperno observes, such episodes as the Bloch-Mendeleeva-Bailey relationship were self-conscious in a way suggesting deliberate aesthetic organization of behavior. In semiotic terms, the artist's life was treated as a text, constructed and read by a method similar to that used in art. Not surprisingly, treating life semiotically as a text was not a satisfactory solution to everyday domestic problems for Bloch-Mendeleeva-Bailey or for another notorious Ziznet-Vorchesko triangle involving the poets Valery Bryusov, Nina Petrovskaya, and again, as familiar third party, Andrei Bielik. To cite, once more, Kodasevich, one of whose special talents was to pour cold water on Silver Age enthusiasms. They attempted to transform art into real life and real life into art. The events of life were never experienced as merely and solely life's events. Instead, because of the lack of clarity and the instability of the boundary lines that outlined reality for these people, the events of life immediately became a part of the internal world, a piece of creation. Conversely, something written by any member of the circle became real, an event of life for all. In this manner, both life and literature were created, as it were, by joint, sometimes hostile, but still united forces of all who found themselves in this extraordinary life in this symbolist dimension. This was, it seems, a true instance of collective creation. And a bit later, Kodasevich adds, the history of the symbolists turned into a history of ruined lives. Cultural immortalism. Immortalism, a search for some form of eternal life not merely in an azure afterworld, but here on the dark, moist Russian earth, emerged as another major theme in the general Promethean ethos. As mentioned earlier in his Reminiscences of Bloch, Andrei Bielik noted that the generation of poets who emerged in the early years of the 20th century in Russia viewed as one of their chief tasks, quote, the problem of combining Vladimir Solovyov and Fedorov with the philosophy of Russian social thought, with Lavov and Herzen, end quote. For Bielik, this meant the fusing of resurrection with reform, a sacred task with social democratic process. As Irene Masing-Dalek has demonstrated in her study of the salvation myth in Russian literature, abolishing death, the initially poetic theme of immortalism, inspired in large part by the writings of Fedorov and Solovyov, spread beyond literature, metamorphosing with many twists and turns into strange new forms of thought and action well into the Soviet period. From Bloch's poem The 12, in which a dozen marauding armed revolutionaries turn out to be led by Jesus Christ bearing the red banner, impervious to bullets, through Mayakovsky's versified drumbeats on the theme of a deathless Soviet future, through the preservation of Lenin's body and the slogan Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live, on through Stalin's grandiose reconstruction scheme, in which the apparent loss of so many lives was made acceptable by the assurance that Soviet science would someday resurrect the victim. Immortalism stretches even into the 1960s children's songs so popular among American students of the Russian language, perhaps not because of its uplifting sentiments, but also because it was extremely easy to remember. Pust festia bude sluns. May there always be sunshine, may there always be blue skies, may there always be mama, may there always be me. During this period, a revolutionary immortality to be achieved by future human labor and science was judged to be superior to the traditional, unverifiable myth of religious immortality that could be known only by faith. Revolutionary immortality meant that individuals would die, but the people for whom the individual died would live on forever. And through inevitable progress in science and labor, the people of the future would eventually restore life to these sacrificed individuals. Fedorov's idea stripped of its religious and monarchical dimensions. If Christ was the firstborn of the mythical resurrection, Lenin, waiting in his glass coffin, would be the first resurrected by science. In a seminal essay on Soviet immortalism, Peter Wiles cites one after another high Soviet official, such as Leonid Krazin, who publicly endorsed the idea of scientific immortalism. He also describes various scientific attempts to extend the human lifespan, including one Dr. Voronov's practice of grafting tissue from ape testicles onto humans, in hopes of extending not only life but virility as well, a treatment undergone by, among other international celebrities, the aging W.B. Yeats. Another example of immortalism noted by Wiles is the practice of the part of perfectly atheistic Soviet citizens of toasting their dead comrades as if they were still present, in the manner of the old Slavic Radunitsa festival, in which the dead ancestors were supposed to reappear for the feast celebrated in their memory. Soviet immortalism exhibits, then, a long-standing Russian fascination, perhaps even obsession with the idea that we must not die. This idea is at the heart of Fedorov's philosophy and continues through the Promethean theurgy of the early Soviet period, extending even to the 21st century, making immortalism one of the most productive branches of today's cosmist research. God building. In spiritual culture, the pre-revolutionary movement of anti-materialist God-seekers, Bogoist Kateli, who gathered around the writer Dmitry Merezovsky and his wife, the poet Zenaida Gippius, led to and was eventually superseded by the God builders, Bogostroiteli, a group of Marxist intellectuals and future Soviet officials, including Alexander Bogdanov, Anatoly Lunacharsky, Leonid Krazin, and Maxim Gorky, who recognized and attempted to redirect the religious character and spiritual energy of the Russian Revolution. During the early decades of the 20th century, leading intellectuals in every field were trying to apply the idea of creating a new Adam for a new Eden to every possible situation and context. Thinkers from many ideological orientations were discovering new dimensions of reality in non-Euclidean mathematics, subatomic physics, depth psychology, structural linguistics, non-European anthropology, Ouspensky metaphysics, and proposing new plans for re-establishing paradise, whether here on Earth or whether other eventually reachable planety somewhere in the physical universe. The Wagnerian impulse to unite all the arts into a single great pageant found early 20th century Russian expression in the 1916 production of Victory Over the Sun, a much derided but recently revived futurist supremacist cosmist opera, for which the futurist poet Alexei Kruchenik contributed the libretto, Mikhail Matsyushkin composed the music, Kazimir Malevich designed the sets, and Vladimir Kalebnikov composed the Zaumian Beyond Rational prologue. Another attempt at universal synthesis and control over nature was Scriabin's unfinished Mysterium, to be set in the Himalayas and to unite smell and touch with music. No audience, all participants, and a 7-day performance leading to a cosmic crescendo, signaling the end of the present human race and the beginning of a next Blavatskian higher race of superhumans. Music thus synthesizes all the arts and becomes a catalyst for evolution. Not only on stage, but throughout the new Soviet Union, nature was to be tamed and trained to serve humanity. A radical and notorious example was Belomorkanal, Stalin's 1931 to 1933 White Sea Canal project, in which some 100,000 political and other prisoners were forced to dig a 140-mile canal, using no modern machinery and under extremely severe conditions, and in the process, quote, reforge themselves, metamorphosing by means of this new social alchemy from enemies of the people into solid, productive Soviet citizens. Between 8,000 and 9,000 died while reforging, and many more were injured or weakened, never to regain their health. A delegation of 120 leading Soviet literary figures, including Gorky, Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Pilnyak, Alexei Tolstoy, and Mikhail Zoshchenko, were treated to a Potemkin tour of the project and praised it as a model for radically transforming both environmental and human nature. As Irene Massing-Delic observes, the literary elite found that the below-more laborers, it could be argued, far from being penalized, were actually being immortalized. One source for the generally atheistic God-building tendency was the traditional importance assigned to incarnation and deification in Russian Orthodox doctrine. God became man so that man could become God. In an essay on Solovyov, Richard Gustafson explains that in the incarnation, as Solovyov understands it, all nature is drawn and strives toward man, while the whole history of humankind is directed toward the God-man. And further, deification does not mean union with the absolute or the attainment of absolute perfection, but the acquisition of immortality, bliss, and a superhuman fullness and intensity of life, often coupled with transformation of the natural cosmos itself. The God-builders, while themselves no longer Orthodox believers, emerged from a profoundly Orthodox culture in which they all at one time had been immersed. In God-building as it developed in Soviet times, in which all traditional notions of God are considered outdated, the incarnation is a relic, no longer a necessary condition for the deification of man. The Promethean man-God updates and displaces Solovyov's God-man. Re-aiming the arrows of Eros. Another aspect of Prometheanism, again traced in part back to Fedorov and Solovyov, was the effort to redirect erotic energy, including the surprisingly common practice among intellectuals of attempting to overcome nature in themselves by practicing chaste, celibate marriage. We have already mentioned this practice in reference to Berdyaev, but Bloch and Mendeleeva and Bieli and his first wife Asya Turgeneva were also said to have enjoyed this kind of relationship. But the married couple most openly celibate were Merkovsky and Gippius, who lived together as platonic soulmates for more than 50 years, apparently never spending a day apart or a conjugal night together. Both considered themselves complete androgynous persons in an immortal harmonious relationship beyond any duty of or need for procreation. In her diary, Gippius recorded that on the evening after their wedding, for which they had worn simple gray street clothes, they quietly read, had dinner, and then departed peacefully into their separate bedrooms. For years after their wedding, Gippius continued to wear her hair in a single braid, traditionally the symbol of virginity. Another who chose celibacy in marriage was Alexander K. Gorsky, a devoted follower of Fedorov who, writing under various pseudonyms, applied Fedorovian ideas to intellectual tendencies of the 1920s and 1930s. We shall discuss his ideas in more detail later. For now, may note only that he vigorously applied Fedorov's idea of regulation of nature to Freud's concept of Eros, and believed that in the new Eden, the new Adam and new Eve would get it right this time, eschewing the apple, opting for obedience over self-will, sublimation over procreation. As Olga Matich observed, the practice of married celibacy was just one of several tendencies in the Promethean attempt to restructure nature by experimenting with alternatives to traditional procreative love and marriage. The ultimate goal of the men and women at the turn of the century was a total transformation of life resulting in earthly immortality. Love played a seminal role in these utopian projects. For Solovov, love was even more powerful than art, in that it had real-life potential to bring about the actual end of history and transform material reality. Following Solovyov, Fedorov and Chernyshevsky's ideal couple in his didactic novel What Is to Be Done, the new men and women of the period, quote, were driven by the eschatological impulse toward rebirth or resurrection, not procreation. Premised on the continuous cycle of birth and death, procreation was rejected. Hence the common preoccupation with abstinence in the here and now, with conquering death by a higher form of love that rechanneled erotic energy away from the biological drive to reproduce. Quote, in their search for something higher, the symbolists offered a variety of erotic practices as alternatives to the traditional family. Among them were platonic love for a soul twin, Dionysian eros, new versions of the romantic triangle, homoerotic love, narcissism, and romantic love for an unattainable object. These models were frequently intertwined, reflecting the eclectic syncretic spirit of the time. Via Czeslaw Ivanov, a leading spirit in the symbolist movement. seems to have been a figure around whom these models and others intertwined, exhibiting a sometimes platonic, sometimes frenzied Dionysian relationship with his wife, Lydia, Zenoviva, and Abal. Sacred incest with Lydia's daughter, Vera, combined sensualist voyeurism and narcissism with the young poet Sergei Gorodetsky, and homosexual relations with younger symbolists such as Mikhail Kuzmin. For his part, in his novel Wings, Kuzmin projected a shining new world of free eroticism for bold fellow Argonauts. We are Hellenes, lovers of the beautiful, the bacchantes of the coming day. Like the visions of Tannhauser in Venus's Grotto, like the inspired revelations of Klinger and Thoma, somewhere lies our ancient kingdom full of sunlight and freedom, of beautiful and courageous people, and thither we sail, my Argonauts, over many a sea, through mist and darkness. And in things yet unheard we shall descry ancient roots, in glittering visions yet unseen we shall know our dear land. Alternatives to traditional marriage and family life easily carried over from the symbolists to early Soviet intellectuals. Lenin and Nadia Krupskaya were married, but for most of their life together, probably not physically intimate. Gorky and Maria Andreeva, on the other hand, who caused a great scandal by traveling together to America, were assumed to be intimate but were not married. Through the late 1920s, traditional attitudes towards love and family were considered to be, at least among many leading intellectuals, holdovers from a dying bourgeois world. Androgyny was often held as an ideal solution to the complex problem of sexual oppression, in which bourgeois society forced men into the unwanted role of oppressor and women into the inescapable role of the oppressed. Alexandra Kollontai, among others, proposed free love as the relationship appropriate to the new socialist people in the new socialist society. Children should be raised by the collective rather than by the biological family, and nostalgia for traditional family behavior and values should be discarded as degrading to both men and women. A look at the biographies of major early Soviet figures finds hardly any in what might be regarded as a traditional marital relationship. Even Lenin and Krupskaya, who stayed together for life, temporarily made room in their relationship for at least one of Lenin's infatuations, the vivacious French revolutionary Inessa Armand. With a tradition of rulers as notorious for unapologetic promiscuity as Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great, Puritanism has not been the powerful recurrent force in Russian culture that it has perhaps been in Britain and North America. In the turbulent early years of Soviet power, a rare individual like Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the secret Soviet police, may have served as a model for extreme personal asceticism in a position of leadership. But many others who led the struggle against remnants of pre-revolutionary bourgeois morality were probably more like Gleb Boki, the head of the OGPU, predecessor of the KGB, cryptology section, who regularly and quite openly invited his fellow high officials and their assistants, male and female, to recreational outings for children of the sun, nude bathing parties that ended as wild, drunken orgies. If in the history of Russia scandalous sexual behavior has ever toppled any powerful figure, the event does not come readily to mind. Flexibility and a tolerant shrug greet practices in Russia that might inspire headlines, resignations, lawsuits, or even criminal charges elsewhere. The varieties of erotic experience prevalent during the period of Promethean theurgy may have seemed more experimental to outsiders than to Russians. Technological utopianism. Another strand of Promethean theurgy worth mentioning in connection with Cosmism is its technological utopianism, for which the artistic antennae were not the symbolists, but the post-symbolist and anti-symbolist poets. Acmeist, Gumilev, Akhmatova, Mandelstam, Futurist, Mayakovsky, Klebnikov, Imaginist, Essenen, and Biocosmist, Ogienko, a.k.a. Sayatogur. Neither the seer with his head in the clouds, nor the peasant with his eyes on the ground, but the urban proletarian worker, master of nature by means of machines and tools, was to be the post-symbolist's new man. Acmeist poets, who grew out of the symbolist reading and discussion circles Vyacheslav Ivanov's Peterburg's Tower. now organized themselves into what they called a craftsman's guild and later a workers' shop. For the rising generation, scientific and technical education was to replace bourgeois humanistic studies. Even formerly humanistic disciplines such as aesthetics and literary criticism became, through the emergence of formalism, technological in orientation, emphasizing the artist's tools, devices, and techniques rather than the broad themes, continuities of the past, and relevance to life and society emphasized by previous generations of critics. Futurists in all the arts, especially the new arts of photography and cinema, took as their subjects cities, architecture, machines, and people at work, man over nature rather than man as part of or subject to nature. A major example of the technological utopian tendency was Alexander Bogdanov, a pre-revolutionary rival outmaneuvered by Lenin in the struggle for control of the Bolshevik Party, and later along with Gorky and Lunacharsky, a leader in the God-building movement mentioned in the previous section. In addition to his socio-political activity, Bogdanov was a physician, an experimental scientist, a seminal opposition thinker, and a science fiction writer. Red Star, his 1908 novel about a Russian scientist, philosopher, social activist who travels to Mars in the company of a Martian disguised as an Earthling, presents the Red Planet as a site of ideal society, harmonious, communist, and sexually egalitarian, which the Russian hopes to import for the benefit of Earth. On Mars, the Russian discovers that the Martian guide he thought was male turns out to be female, and the complicated love story that follows is interspersed with descriptions of the social and technological wonders of Mars, as well as intrigues including mortal combat against a brilliant but heartless villain intent on colonizing Earth. Though primarily of historical interest now, Red Star in its own time was considered an important literary work, and Bogdanov followed its success with a shorter work, Engineer Many, a 1913 prequel describing how communism was established on Mars. Bogdanov continued his theme in A Martian Stranded on Earth, a poem that appeared to be an introduction to a sequel to Red Star. As a scientist, Bogdanov experimented with blood transfusions as a means of rejuvenation, and found that he indeed looked and felt much younger as a result of the transfusions he had performed on himself. But like his fictitious predecessor from half a century before, Turgenev's Bazarov, who contended in Fathers and Sons that nature was not a temple but a laboratory, Bogdanov died as a result of his own medical experiment, probably from injecting himself with blood of an incompatible type. Bogdanov's major philosophical work was Techtology, a 3-volume collection of essays that defined a new comprehensive science, a way of organizing knowledge now regarded as a precursor of systems analysis and cybernetics. Nature, in Bogdanov's view, is essentially an organization of complexes of phenomena, and the human task is to be master of that organization. Ovladani, mastery, control, is the key concept throughout Bogdanov's thought. In Bernice Rosenthal's concise summary, Bogdanov tried to create a monistic metascience of nature and society that would unite the most disparate phenomena in the organic and inorganic worlds, a planned global organization of things, people, and ideas in one well-structured system. Bogdanov wanted to replace chaos with cosmos, to bring order and harmony into a strife-torn world. On one level, techtology was an attempt to realize Marx's concept of a single science of man. On another level, it was a technological version of the symbolist project of life creation. The emphasis on technology as a means to achieve an ideal society echoes Fedorov's common task, but largely ignores Fedorov's insistence that religious and spiritual development must accompany technological advance. Without significant spiritual development, Fedorov feared, technological progress alone could lead only to a mechanical hell. Another difference is that even though Bogdanov sends his character to Mars, all his concerns remain focused on Earth. Bogdanov's interest is in earthly society, not the total cosmos of which our planet is a part. Despite futuristic intentions, Bogdanov's universe is not Copernican but Ptolemaic. Like Bogdanov, Fedorov, and the scientific cosmists Vernadsky, Tsiolkovsky, and Chizevsky all viewed science as vital to our survival, but unlike Bogdanov, they project our survival as inhabitants and even potential masters of more of the universe than one small planet. Occultism. Civilization cannot evolve further until the occult is taken for granted on the same level as atomic energy. Colin Wilson, The Occult, A History. The last tendency we shall mention here in connection with the Promethean echoes of the ethos of the first decades of the 20th century is occultism, which was seamlessly interwoven with all the tendencies previously discussed. Life creation, immortalism, God-building, redirected eroticism, and technological utopianism, as Maria Carlson had written about Silver Age Russia. Occultism in a bewildering variety of forms was a popular intellectual fashion of the period. Most educated readers had at least a nodding acquaintance with spiritualism and theosophy, but there was also Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, Martinism, Hermeticism, as well as manifestations of common or boulevard mysticism, such as somnambulism, chiromancy, tarot, phrenology, mesmerism, astrology, fortune-telling, and dream interpretation. In the cities, people attended public and private seances, demonstrations of hypnotism, and lectures by famous Indian yogis. For creative, innovative individuals like Bielki, Alexander Scriabin, Konstantin Belmont, Max Voloshin, Nikolai Roerich, Vasily Kandinsky, occult philosophy was a lifetime pursuit that impinged on all aspects of the personal, spiritual, and creative lives. To ignore this dimension in their work is like trying to understand medieval art without a knowledge of Christianity. Although each of the forms of occultism listed above by Carlson has its own special emphasis and orientation, they all have enough in common that a consideration of some of the major ideas central to theosophy may be relevant to most of the others as well. The worldwide movement known today as theosophy from the Greek divine wisdom was founded by Helena Petrova Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, or HPB, in New York in 1875. But like most other esoteric societies, it defines itself as a revival of timeless wisdom known in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Greece, or perhaps even earlier in vanished Atlantis. Guardians of that ancient wisdom called in theosophy the Mahatmas, a highly evolved brotherhood of spiritually advanced masters, are believed to still reside in small hidden communities in inaccessible places in or near the Himalayas. Sometimes these masters leave their communities to travel about the world, either in astral bodies or incognito in physical bodies, delivering the Brotherhood's instructions for the benefit of all humanity to a few chosen worthy recipients, who in turn are then able to pass along this timeless wisdom to a wider public in the idiom of their place and time. The wisdom to be communicated is of two kinds: exoteric, presented in books, popular media, and open meetings for the general public, and esoteric, communicated only orally, one-on-one, to the initiated adept worthy to receive and retain the secret teaching. Outside theosophy, this tendency towards esotericism can be seen in the use of code words and images, understood merely in a mundane sense by the uninitiated but recognizable as keys to a higher meaning by those in the know. As an example, Andre Bailey's use of colors in St. Petersburg may seem merely vivid description to most readers, but have higher anthroposophical significance to those familiar with the theories of Rudolf Steiner, as do the paintings of Kandinsky and the compositions of Scriabin. In theosophy, the fundamental exoteric public teaching consists of the three objects. First, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinctions of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Second, to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. And third, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. The esoteric teachings which HPB communicated to a group of her closest followers, and which are apparently still presented and studied in special groups today, are said to deal with special techniques for spiritual advancement and deep penetration into the mysteries presented in the secret doctrine. HPB's multi-volume masterpiece, readily available but largely impenetrable to the unaided lay reader. In the wider society, all branches of the socialist movement shared the first object of theosophy, viewing themselves as a vanguard of universal human brotherhood. A growing awareness of and interest in the diverse religions of the Siberian and Central Asian parts of the Russian Empire, marked especially by the 1913 opening of a Buddhist temple by the Buryat Lama Agvan Dorjiev in St. Petersburg, and the movement on the part of intellectuals away from dogmatic orthodoxy towards more creative versions of Christianity, such as variations of Solovyov's Sophiology and the Merzhkovsky-Gypius proclamation of a Third Testament, parallels Theosophy's second object, a comparative approach to religion, philosophy, and science. The third object, exploration of unexplained laws and latent powers, was reflected everywhere in the wider culture, from Rasputin's role as mystical healer in the Tsarist court to the popularity of presentations by Gurdjieff and Uspensky, to the laboratory experiments of paranormal activities and abilities conducted by Gleb Boki's section of the early Soviet secret police, and the many varied investigations into psychic phenomena reported in the 1970s bestseller by Shaila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. Evolution in theosophical literature was not a one-way Darwinian progress from simple to more complex organisms and species, but an up and down roundabout process starting with eons of descent of spirit into matter, and now entering the early stages of a reascent of matter upward again into spirit. Present humanity is not the most advanced in history. Vanished races of humanity, Atlantean and Lemurian, were physically, mentally, and spiritually superior to present humans. The Himalayan masters retain traces of the qualities lost by humanity in general, and these traces now serve as guides for the future evolution of humanity. The prelude to the secret doctrine in the form of the stanzas of the Xian, said by HPB to be the records of a people unknown to ethnology, which were discovered in manuscript form in a cave connected to a Tibetan monastery, written in a tongue absent from the nomenclature of languages and dialects with which philology is acquainted. Since the language of the stanzas was unknown, HPB apparently was able to translate them only by an occult method of telepathic precipitation from a higher master. Commentators who have not only read but understood the stanzas report that they contain the germ of the entire secret doctrine. Maria Carlson characterizes the secret doctrine as a whole as eclectic, syncretic, dogmatic, strongly pantheistic, and heavily laced with exotic Buddhist thought and vocabulary, and not a few false analogies, combining bits and pieces of Neoplatonism, Brahmanism, Buddhism, Kabbalism, Gnosticism, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, and other occult doctrines, past and present, in an occasionally undiscriminating philosophical melange. Blavatsky was trying to create a scientific religion, a modern gnosis, based on absolute knowledge of things of spiritual rather than on faith. It was an attempt to bridge the perceived abyss between science and religion and between reason and faith. The elitist, anti-positivist, Zaumny, beyond rational character of theosophy and the other forms of occultism resonated powerfully with many Silver Age Russian intellectuals. The world and mindset characterized by Dostoevsky's underground man as twice two makes four belonged to the previous age of realism and rationalism, inadequate to quantify the new realities. Twice two makes five, irrational perhaps, but stated in the form of a rational proposition, was an equation better suited to the new times. Even writers and thinkers whose reputations for anti-mystical, anti-theosophical views of the world sometimes succumb to the attractions of the occult. The acmeist poet and theoretician Nikolai Gumilev, for example, famously rejected the symbolist poet's fraternization with mysticism, then theosophy, then occultism. But many of his own best poems, such as Sixth Sense, The Forest, The Serpent, The Music, Memory, and others, especially in his most highly regarded collections, Bonfire, Coaster, and Pillar of Fire, Eugenie Stulp, are full of past lives, supernatural beings, uncanny transformations, paranormal abilities and events, and in the early Soviet Union, even prominent officials, nominally atheists and materialists, exhibited keen interest in studies normally associated with the occult. Maxim Gorky, for example, endorsed the neurologist and father of objective psychology Vladimir Bekhtyarov's experiments in thought transference. From the 1920s through the 1970s, Soviet scientists in special laboratories were conducting parapsychology experiments involving humans and animals' eyeless sight and energy bodies, and using Kirlian photography to record the auras of humans, animals, and plants. The filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, 1898 to 1948, was a Rosicrucian initiate who gathered around himself a Gnostic circle of adepts prominent in the history of Soviet film and visual arts. According to Dmitry Shostakovich, Stalin, who devoted no amount of energy to attempting to root out every trace of superstition, his terms for religion, was himself an extremely superstitious man. And Mark Bennett, a Guardian and online journalist who is writing a book about Russia's obsession with the occult, tells us, aside from widespread, albeit whispered, rumors that Stalin was an occult adept himself, the 1930s saw speculation that the dictator made use of the unearthly powers of one Natalia Lvova, a third-generation witch. Shake-ups in the top ranks of the party, which usually meant a trip to the gulag for the unfortunate official, were said by terrified Muscovites to be the result of Stalin and Lvova's black magic Kremlin session. Much has been written about occult researches and activities during the Third Reich in Germany. But the Soviets apparently also developed their own equivalent of the Nazi Anarebe, the search for ancestral Aryan roots in ancient occult artifacts. The Russian equivalent was centered on the mysterious Red Merlin, Alexander Barchenko, a medical school dropout, writer of occult adventure stories and follower of the French esotericist Alexandre Saint-Ives d'Aldray, popularizer of the legend of Agartha, a subterranean paradise hidden in a network of caves somewhere in Central Asia. Barchenko persuaded the OGPU secret police section head Gleb Boki to sponsor paranormal research in government laboratories and to undertake a mission to Central Asia in search of the magical kingdom of Shambhala, where powerful secret knowledge was hidden that could win the world for the Bolshevik cause. The expedition failed in its attempts to enter Tibet, but with secret police sponsorship, Barchenko continued to explore other remote areas in search of esoteric knowledge. The Kola Peninsula, in search of remnants of an ancient civilization said to have known the secret of splitting the atom. The Altai region, to investigate the ability of shamanic drumming to induce altered states of consciousness. The Crimean Peninsula, to study the secret meaning of Sufi teachings and practices. And Kostroma in central Russia, where members of the Old Believer sect set legends of Belovody, beautiful white water, their hidden dreamland. In his testimony before the 1937 tribunal that would sentence him to death, Gleb Boki described Barchenko's idea. According to Barchenko, in ancient times there existed a culturally advanced society that later perished as a result of geological catastrophe. This was a communist society, and it existed in a more advanced social, communist, and materially technical form than ours. The remnants of this society, as Barchenko told us, still exist in remote mountain areas at the intersection of India, Tibet, Kashgar, and Afghanistan. This ancient science accumulated all scientific and technical knowledge, representing a synthesis of all branches of science. The existence of this ancient society is a secret carefully guarded by its members. Barchenko called himself a follower of this ancient society, stressing that he was initiated into it by messengers of its religio-political center. As described by Boki, Barchenko's idea owes much not only to Saint-Ives d'Aldray, but also to Madame Blavatsky, and though he was probably unaware of it, Fedorov's idea of the Pamir region as a prehistoric paradise in need of restoration. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, as we shall see later in this study, similar ideas resurfaced, this time about Arctos, the hypothetical original Arctic homeland of the Indo-European people. Groups of investigators who called themselves Hyperboreans, some of whom were also Cosmists or at least published in Cosmist publications, set off on far northern expeditions to search for confirmation of their theory. Although the examples of Promethean theurgy outlined above do not exhibit all the qualities earlier defined as Cosmists, they do indicate the broadly shared, rich and dynamic intellectual and cultural background from which the Cosmist movement emerged and back into which it fed. In the next section, we shall consider the ideas and activities of several followers of Fedorov: Iona Bryknichev, Alexander Gorsky, Nikolai Setnitsky, Valerian Murvyov, and Vasily Shekrigin, whose works helped to turn Fedorovism into the broader movement of Cosmism. Thus concludes section 11:10 of the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Future of Nikolai Fedorov and His Followers, by George Young.
Stick with us next time when we will work on section 1111. I will see you then.